Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh. Let's talk about Isaiah chapter 3. So, last episode in chapter 2, we talked about two different poems in the chapter, and there was this vision of a future temple, and there was a universalist message that all nations would receive the message of the Lord, and that they would flow to this temple, and there would be world peace with people beating swords into plowshares and all of that. But we also talked about a coming day of the Lord, which would be a day of judgment on the powerful and the corrupt people, and that idols would be abandoned. We started with this vision of the glorious temple and world peace and an ideal city in the last days. But then we talked about the world collapsing with all the things of mankind that they put their trust in falling apart. In chapter 3, this is going to be another prophecy of this sort, talking about societal collapse. But then in chapter 4, we're going to return to the vision of a restored society. So in this episode, we're going to talk first of all about how we know the meaning of words when we translate from the Hebrew. We're going to talk about the city of Jerusalem, this idealized city, losing its leadership. And we're going to talk about oppression and poor leaders that were in the city. Then we're going to go into the daughter metaphor. And this is an extended metaphor here where we personify Jerusalem as a daughter. And we're going to also talk about where does this chapter actually end? You must remember that chapters and verse divisions are a much later addition, well after the composition of the text, centuries after the composition of the text, were chapters and verses decided upon. And so it's not terribly clear that the chapter divisions always line up with where they are today. And of course, there's not always agreement in different editions of the Bible as to where chapters should end. Let's talk about it here a bit. As we go into chapter 3, the question is how do we know the meanings of words? And there are three basic things that we use to find the meanings of words. The first one is tradition. Some languages we don't have traditions for. A good example of this would be Egyptian and Akkadian. Egyptian famously was not known until the latter part of the 19th century, when the Rosetta Stone allowed us to finally crack the language. And this was a stone that had text in it in two forms of Egyptian and also the same text in Greek. Greek was known, and we were able from this to use it as a system to decipher the language. And so even though there was no tradition for Egyptian, we were able to eventually read it. We can't read it as well as other languages where we have had an unbroken tradition, Latin being a good example of that, where from the time it was originally spoken until modern times, there were some people who knew and understand how the language works. Hebrew is one of these languages. We have an unbroken tradition from the time that it was actually a spoken language until the present day of some group of people who understood the basics of how the language works and what the words in it mean. With Egyptian, this was lost. Another example is Akkadian. Akkadian was lost. For a while, they weren't even really sure that it was a language. They just thought it was decorative marks, perhaps, on clay tablets. But then a very, very smart man by the name of George Smith, a story that's well worth reading, he was able to decipher the language, even though he was himself not really formally educated. He was just simply brilliant. And he was able to put together this language, and we were able to know Akkadian. These languages are challenging, and the translations from them are often much less certain because everything we know of these languages, we've had to decipher and reverse engineer. So I want to express with this just how important tradition is to understanding a language. It gives us a great starting point to understand the language, without which it would be much more difficult and the translations would be much less certain. That said, traditions are often not correct. Sometimes things change in language. Well, always things change in language, especially if it is a living spoken language. And Hebrew was for centuries. During the composition of the text, it was a living spoken language. And so we should not expect the Hebrew of the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age to be the same as the Hebrew that Isaiah uses. Languages change over centuries. Words change meanings. Grammar changes. Syntax changes. And we see some evidence of this in the text. When we talk about that traditions are preserved, we have to ask which traditions were preserved and what changes may have taken place over those centuries. Certainly some things were changed. There's also a great deal of things that are simply lost, words that no one any longer remembers the meaning of. What do you do with those situations? Well, tradition tends to come up with something creative for the word to mean. Sometimes this is not correct. Sometimes it does not reflect at all what the original meaning of the word was. And so tradition by itself is not enough to give good and accurate translation of a text. So what are other tools for understanding what a text is saying when we're translating from Hebrew? The second tool we have is context. As we look at these words, they are not in isolation. They are in a text. The text is describing something, and they are often part of a sentence that describes something. So we ask, what is the meaning of the sentence that this word is found in? What meanings would make sense in that context? The other thing is that Hebrew, especially in poetry, likes to speak in parallels. There will be two lines that use synonyms or antonyms with each other, and we discussed this in previous episodes. This is great if you have a word that you do not know the meaning of, but it is in a parallel, then you can use that parallel to see what a synonym of the word is and give you a good idea of what this word should mean. Now, we also have larger context. The words that are hardest to understand their meaning are the words that are used the least frequently. If a word is used frequently, we can find many places where it is used and use that context from the many places to decipher not only its main meaning, but also nuances that it might have. To do this, we have word studies, where we look at everywhere in the entire corpus of writing available to us, which in the case of ancient Hebrew is primarily the Hebrew Bible, although there are a few other places, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and a couple of inscriptions that also exist. For the most part, with ancient Hebrew, it's in the Hebrew Bible is the context we have for that language. We look at the use of those words throughout the entire corpus of text available to us, and we ask what meanings they have in the various places that they are used. This can often give us a lot of insight. But if a word is only used a few times, sometimes we're really grasping to understand what it might have meant to the original author. And that brings us to our last term here, which is a hapax legomenon. That basically is a fancy term there for a word which occurs only one time in the entire corpus of the text. So a word which occurs only one time in the entire Hebrew Bible is a hapax, or a hapax legomenon. These words are especially challenging because often we have nothing but tradition to go on as to what they mean, and we can't verify the context by its usage anywhere else. And so often there is a great deal of guesswork that comes into these. This brings us to our third tool that we have, which is comparative linguistics. Hebrew did not exist in isolation. They had a variety of neighbors among the Canaanites and among the other nations and cultures around them. These nations often spoke languages that were closely related to Hebrew, often referred to as Semitic languages, but even non-Semitic languages like Egyptian would influence the speech that was going on in the nation of Israel and Judah. And so we have in the modern period access to a lot more texts than we've ever had access to before, as we have deciphered some of these languages and as we have found archaeological caches containing large amounts of their records. We find texts that closely reflect the language of the Hebrew Bible. We find stories that parallel stories in the Hebrew Bible. And most importantly, we find words that may occur very infrequently in the Hebrew Bible, whose meaning is uncertain, that occur more frequently in some of these other texts and give us ideas of what those words mean in other languages. Now, often these are not the exact same word because these are not the exact same languages, but since they're closely related languages, the words are what's called cognates. The languages originally were one language and some point in the past split off. Their meanings might be different between the languages, but the meaning in the other neighboring society will give us an idea of what the word meant to that society. And we can sometimes use that to extrapolate what it would have meant to the Israelite societies. Some of the main languages that we look for here is Ugaritic, Akkadian, which I mentioned a moment ago, Aramaic, which would become a very important language in the end of the biblical period. It also does feature prominently in Isaiah, and of course, ancient Arabic, but other languages as well, including ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, Ethiopic. A lot of the languages in the surrounding societies all had influence on the Israelites. They would take words from these other languages as loan words and use them in their texts. They would have just a variety of cultural interchange with these other cultures and peoples. And so understanding and having access to these texts of the surrounding cultures is essential to us understanding the Hebrew language. And it is where most of the new information about the Hebrew language that's happened over the past century and a half or so has come from. And it is part of why, if you are trying to read and learn Hebrew, you need an up-to-date and modern lexicon. Most of the lexicons you will find for free on the internet, well, they are very old, more than a century old. Of the ones you will find commonly on the internet, the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon is probably the best, but it is very outdated. It does not have access to all the things we have learned since we have discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. It does not have access to a lot of the things that we have learned by reading these texts that have been found in the past century. We've learned a lot more about what words mean since that time. This is actually a great time to be translating ancient Hebrew because we have more knowledge now than they have had at any previous point, other than when the language, of course, was a living language and knowledge of it was common. These are the three tools that we have for understanding the way words are used in the Hebrew Bible. We have tradition, we have context, and we have comparative linguistics. And that's really it. Without those three tools, we really don't know what the text says. This is going to become relevant in this chapter because chapter 3 is somewhat famous for its obscure vocabulary. And it's going to be a repeating thing throughout the rest of Isaiah, that we're getting into some very difficult to translate sections here because in many places, the Hebrew is unclear and it is very unique. Isaiah was a master of language, and we can expect him to use obscure words or to use words in interesting and different ways. He was writing in poetry. He was going for a certain effect. In this chapter particularly, we're going to see a whole bunch of words that the poor King James translators had no idea what they meant, and they just kind of had to go with it because you've got to translate something. And this is always the problem with translations, is if you're reading it in translation, you can't tell the difference between a passage that is very clear in the original and the meaning is quite clear, and a passage where we're really not sure what it said, and the translation is just a best guess. Translations in general tend to obscure this aspect of the text. What I will hopefully do here is to enlighten somewhat on where there are difficult passages in Isaiah, particularly in this chapter, as we go through. So let's begin at the beginning. We have a judgment on Judah and Jerusalem. For behold, the Master, Lord of hosts, is taking away from Jerusalem and from Judah support and supply, all support of bread and all support of water. The support and supply here, they're actually the same word in Hebrew, but they are the masculine and feminine forms of the same word. And this is something that Isaiah does frequently in poetry. He will use a word and use both the masculine and feminine gender of it for poetic effect. Now, interestingly, it then sticks to the masculine in the next two lines that follow. It seems like where he introduced it with the masculine and feminine, it should then also alternate with masculine and feminine, and maybe it did originally, and maybe that was lost through the copyists that have had this text for a while, but it does not seem to preserve that in the following two lines. But we're saying here that the Master Lord, and this is the phrase here, Adonai Yahweh of armies, of hosts, is taking away from Jerusalem particularly, and that's the capital city of the nation of Judah, all the bread and water. They're going to be having a shortage of food and water. This is a tragedy in the ancient world and something that modern people don't fully appreciate or understand. Starvation was a terrifying condition, and it was often the condition of warfare. Sieges against cities would result in terrible suffering and starvation. But we're not going to just lose our bread and water, because then he gives a whole list of things that we're going to lose. The mighty man. This is a word that means an elite soldier. This is definitely a military title, a gibor. The soldier, parallel to the mighty man. The judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder, the captain of 50, the man of rank, the counselor, and the skillful magician, and the expert in charms. So let's talk about a couple of these here. Some of them are a little more straightforward than others. The diviner is often not a good title. It often is referred to people who are more of pagan soothsayers. And soothsayer might actually be a great translation there, but this is not necessarily a approved thing that he's talking about here, but this is someone that would have had rank in their society. And so we're losing the prophet, a term generally used for legitimate representation of the proper religion, and we're also losing the soothsayers. We're losing the military. We're losing the judiciary. The elder. These were people that had special status in society to govern. We're losing the captain of 50. This is, again, a military title here. The man of rank. This is actually a bit of a loose translation here. The Hebrew actually literally says the lifted up of face. So apparently somebody who had a facelift. This man of rank is someone that is special in society, though, someone who is a leader. The counselor. This obviously is someone who helps lead the city, someone who is an advisor to the political leaders and so forth. And then we end it with some very questionable positions here of the skillful magician and the expert in charms. The Hebrew literally says the wise with respect to magic. It is karashim for magic, and some can understand that to possibly have a homonym there, which would mean a craftsman. And so some translations, you will see this listed as the skillful craftsman. It is much more likely that it is talking about magic because of listing the diviner and the expert in charms right after it. So this is probably more a magician than a craftsman. But either way, the leaders of the city, both appropriate and inappropriate, are all going to go away, along with all the bread and water. So we have a very dystopian outlook immediately here. Then as we move forward, and I will make boys their princes, and infants, maybe cruelty. Cruelty shall rule over them, and the people will oppress one another, man against man, and a man against his neighbor. The boy will be insolent to the elder, and the despised to the honorable. Let's talk about the word infants that I crossed out there. The word in Hebrew is ta'alulim. It is often understood as an abstract plural meaning wantonness or cruelty. In this case, the chief characteristics of these leaders is substituted for the leaders themselves. However, several translations make the parallelism tighter by changing the word to olim, which means infants or children. They felt that because the first line says boys, this next line should say infants, and so they changed the Hebrew text to say that. So basically, there are two words here that are very close to each other. There's only really a letter or two different between them. And the one word means infants, and the other word means cruelty. The one that is actually written in the text means cruelty, but some translations prefer to translate this as infants because of the word boys in the previous line. This is going to come up again when we get down to verse 12. I like the translation of cruelty better here, and by the end of the chapter, you'll have to let me know what you think. Leave a comment in the notes. This word that shows up here as cruelty, it only occurs here at this one spot and also in the last chapter of Isaiah and nowhere else in the Bible. So this is one of those rare words. In order to translate it as infants or babies, you have to actually remove a letter from the word. And so that is part of why I keep it as cruelty, although it is a very rare word, only used in Isaiah and only in 2 places. In this, we have the idea that there is cruelty throughout. The people are oppressing one another, man against man against his neighbor. And we do have the idea here that the youth are not respecting the elders, that the people of a lower class are disrespectful to those who are of a higher class. We don't really quite know what that means to Isaiah. What is a despised person? What is an honorable person? It may refer to economic status. It might also refer to righteousness status, that the person who is unrighteous is behaving poorly against those that are worthy or more righteous. It might refer to educational status, could be any number of things. Society has broken down. The normal norms that we have in society are dissolving because there is no food and there is no water and there is no leadership. And so we come here to the results of this. For a man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, "You have a cloak, you'll be our leader. And this heap of ruins will be under your rule." Nobody wants that job. In that day, he'll speak out saying, "I will not be a binder of wounds. In my house there is neither bread nor cloak. You shall not make me a leader of the people." This is a world where no one in their right minds wants to be a politician. What was usually a position of honor is now a terrible job that people do not want. They're backing out of it. Now, I should note here that binder of wounds is what the Hebrew says. Literally, some translations simply simplify that down to healer, but it is literally somebody who binds up a wound, suggesting that the country itself has been wounded in terrible ways and is in need of someone to perform first aid on it. So yes, we're looking for someone to restore the glory of Jerusalem here, and no one wants to do it. Nobody wants that position. And we have a nice little tight chiasm here. For has stumbled Jerusalem, and Judah has fallen. Very nicely done there. One simple line that tells you the status of the city. Because their tongue and their deeds are against the Lord, defying the eyes of his glory. They've become a failed state. The verb fallen here is a masculine in our traditional text. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually preserves it as a feminine verb, which is actually more typical when you're speaking of a city or a nation, and also more typical considering that we are about to personify the city as a daughter just down the road here. So the Dead Sea Scrolls is probably the more accurate version here, that this should be a feminine verb in this spot. The defying the eyes of his glory is a little bit of an unusual phrase. There are a couple of different approaches to how to translate that, but this is somewhat literally what it says. So how have they become a fallen state? For the look on their faces bears witness against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their souls, for they have brought evil on themselves. We have here again the reference of Jerusalem becoming like Sodom. This is something we started out with in Isaiah and is now being revisited. They are not trying to even hide the things they're doing wrong, and they have brought this destruction on themselves, is Isaiah's message. Tell the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for what his hands have dealt out shall be returned to him. The traditional text says shall be done to him. I'm going with the Dead Sea Scrolls again here, which has a different word there, returned. It seems to fit better with the context, and I think it is the more accurate reading. But we have here a AB poetic pattern with an antithetical parallel. So we have the righteous, will be well with him. The wicked, it will be ill with him. We have they shall eat the fruit of their deeds, and opposed to that, what his hands have dealt shall be returned to him, meaning that they will get their justice handed to them. Now we come to verse 12, where we have a bit of a return to what we had before. The traditional translation here is, my people, infants are their oppressors and women rule over them. Obviously, not everybody's going to be thrilled with the idea that women ruling over them is a terrible thing. And I want to point out here that the Hebrew Bible isn't necessarily that opposed to the idea of women ruling. The story of Deborah, the prophetess, in Judges 4 and 5 is one example of that. Also, The prophetess Huldah is another. These were women who had positions of power and leadership. We also would later have stories of Esther. So we are not opposed to the idea of women leadership, but that's not the reason that it's crossed out. Here again, we have this word for infants. This time it is actually the word for infants. But the question is, rather than correcting the previous verse to go from cruelty to infants, maybe this verse should be amended in the other direction to go from infants to cruelty to reflect back to that previous verse. Then it becomes, my people, oppressors treat them cruelly, the basic sense of what it's saying here. Now, there is a bit of a parallel here that we can take infants and women as parallel to each other, and so that's part of what makes the traditional translation appealing. And so this is a bit of a controversial emendation right here. But if we take that the first reference was not to babes, but to oppressors in the previous verse, then it makes sense that this word here should be that same word and saying, my people, oppressors treat them cruelly. And then we come to the word women. There is a word for women in Hebrew, which is nashim. And there is a word for creditors in Hebrew, which is noshim. They are spelled the same way. In Hebrew, it did not have vowels at the time of the textual composition. The vowels were added centuries later. And so without the vowels, it is not possible to tell which word was meant here. We do, however, have many ancient translations. The translations, particularly of the Vulgate, the Septuagint, and the Targum, that's the Latin, the Greek, and the Aramaic, all have cruelty here rather than children. And also the Septuagint and the Targum have creditors rather than women. So it is not some modern feminist revisionism here to cross out women. It is actually supported by ancient translations that this should read creditors here. And so if we go with reflecting what the ancient Greek translation or the ancient Aramaic translation is, then what I have here actually fits very nicely. My people, oppressors treat them cruelly, and creditors rule over them. What we're about to talk about here looks a lot like debt slavery, as what we're about to describe. And so the idea that they are being treated by oppressors cruelly and that there are creditors who are in charge of them makes more sense than the idea that they're being beaten up by women and children. We then have the line here, "Oh, my people, your guides mislead you. They have swallowed up the course of your paths." So the very people that should be leading the people have misled them and have brought them into a situation where those who are in charge of the political leadership are oppressors, and they are vastly in debt and controlled by their creditors. So how will this resolve? We now go into something that looks very much like a legal text. The Lord has taken his place to contend. He stands to judge peoples. We have here the idea of a calling into a judgment situation, a legal, I don't want to say courtroom because I don't want to put in people's minds the idea that this corresponds to a common American courtroom. This is a different place, a different society. Courts were quite a bit different. They often involved a council of elders, often in the gate area of the city, settling disputes. So try not to think of this in terms of black robes and silly wigs and gavels and all that. That's not what's happening here. But the Lord has taken his place to contend, and he stands to judge peoples. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. So he is going to bring judgment to the political leaders of the people. And we have here then an accusation. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor, declares the master, Lord of hosts. So this is his military title here. This is intended to be a very frightening accusation against those who lead the people. And what is he concerned with? He is concerned with the poor and the underrepresented. They have been abused by the ruling class. And he also uses the idea here of, you have devoured my vineyard. It appears that Isaiah is the one who came up with the metaphor of the house of Israel being a vineyard. It is a metaphor that will be repeated many times after Isaiah. But it seems that it may have originated with him, this idea of referring to the people of the Lord as the vineyard. And we're even going to see in a few chapters that he gets very explicit with that. But he is accusing them of having devoured the vineyard, taken the wealth of the poor and brought it into their own houses. They are enriching themselves at the cost of the common man. They're crushing the people, grinding their faces. This actual last line here declares the master, Lord of hosts. That is the same title that he opened this with in verse 1. Interestingly, that line is not in the Septuagint, but it probably belongs there. It makes sort of an envelope encasing for this first half of the chapter, where we have said that the city is going to fall. We're going to lose all of the food and water, all of the leadership. There will be nobody who wants to lead. Their sins have been like Sodom. They have done terrible things, and the Lord stands up to bring justice to the people, and he puts out this harsh accusation. So now we're going to go to the second half of the chapter, where we're going to have a little bit of a connected theme with this. We're going to go into an extended metaphor about the daughters of Zion. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, that means lifted up, proud. Because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet. Therefore, the master will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their foreheads. Okay, let's unpack a few things in this. Glancing wantonly with their eyes. The word translated as wantonly has two possible meanings. One is to make seductive glances, to ogle, to blink, or to wink. Or the other option is to paint the eyes with a red color using facial makeup. We don't know. This is not a commonly used word. That's what it could mean. We don't know if this is actually about that they can flutter their eyelashes or that they have painted their eyes with particularly a red colored makeup. There's a lot of questions around what the word actually means, but something with their eyes is being used here to express their haughtiness, and they're walking with outstretched necks, which again seems to be an indication of their pride and their vanity. Mincing along as they go. This word mincing is only used here, nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. There is possibly a similar word in Arabic that indicates a horse that trips. So from that, we have the idea that it's something to do with how they walk. How that works is hard to say. Another possible meaning of the word is that it means lively. And a third possible meaning of the word, and this is all coming from the lexicon, Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, which is where most of the meanings I'm going to be talking about actually originate from. The second meaning is that it means lively, and the third meaning is that it means deficient. So armed with that information, make of this word what you will. We really don't know what mincing really is, but they're doing it as they go or as they walk. So they're doing something with their eyes, and they're doing something as they walk, maybe similar to how a horse trips along. Does that make sense to anyone? This is where translations often cloak the uncertainty behind the language. Now, tinkling with their feet. The word tinkling comes completely from tradition. Again, the word occurs only here, nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible. Looking at Arabic doesn't seem terribly helpful. There's a word that is similar in Arabic that means to hold back the head of a camel or of some other animal when it is being broken in or slaughtered. Yeah, I don't know how to make anything out of that either. Looking at a similar word from the Dead Sea Scrolls, some have suggested pop as a possible meaning. The traditional meaning is the only one that seems to work in context. The word here is very similar to the word for anklet in verse 18 that we'll take a look at, but we're not really sure what that word in verse 18 really means either. So we're really guessing, tinkling with their feet, uncertain what it's really saying they're doing. But there's something about what they're doing with their eyes, something about how they walk, something about their feet. And it all seems to be related to the idea that they are filled with vanity and pride. So we take here the next part. Therefore, the master will strike with a scab. The word scab only occurs here. You're going to hear a lot of that. It might mean baldness. And so it might be saying here that the master will strike with baldness. Now, given what we are going to discuss happening to the daughters of Zion here, there is a lot of it that centers on humiliation. And a lot of what is happening with the humiliation here sounds like what might happen in a setting of warfare where they are taken captive. And so the cutting off of a woman's hair, making her bald, is the type of humiliation invading soldiers might perform on women. And so we have to talk here a little bit about the metaphor in general. Why make Zion a daughter? We are naturally protective of our children, particularly our daughters. And so this should give you a feeling in your heart of a daughter who has become too worldly, too proud, but that is still beloved. And seeing terrible things happen to her should cause an emotional reaction. And that is what Isaiah is going for here. The daughters are not behaving. But the idea of someone taking your daughter, no matter how she's behaving, and cutting off her hair and taking her captive should rip at your heart. And that is what Isaiah is going for here. So the master will strike them with a scab, the heads of the daughters of Zion, possibly baldness. Then this last part here, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. This is, again, a rare word that is only used here that's translated as secret parts. It is unclear what part of the body it actually represents. King James Version, which puts in secret parts, follows a traditional meaning, again, tradition, that it refers to female genitals. The context, again, is one of humiliation, such as you might expect when you're taking captive a foreign army. The idea that if you're taking women captive, you might strip them of their clothing. And that's horrific. But the Hebrew word here is pot, and there is an Akkadian word, potu, that we think might be a good cognate with this word. And we've only learned Akkadian in the last century or so. The lexicon prefers that reading from Akkadian, and because it talks about their possible baldness, which was gadgod, that we think that it would make a nice parallel here if this also referred to the head, which is what it means in Akkadian, and so their forehead seems to be a better translation for what it means by pope. And so we get that from comparative linguistics rather than from tradition. So the master will strike with baldness the heads of the daughters of Zion and will lay bare their foreheads. That actually works very nicely as a parallel there and still keeps this idea of humiliation. Although clearly laying bare their secret parts would also be an act of humiliation. So there's not a tremendous amount of meaning difference between the two. We're both talking about a situation that would be horrific to see happening to a daughter. But there is a question as to what the word actually means, and it's used only here. So now, as we're talking about what's happening to the daughters of Zion, we go into a bit more detail. In that day, the master will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands, and the crescents, and the pendants, and the bracelets, and the scarves, and the headdresses, and the armlets, and the sashes, and the perfume boxes, and the amulets, and the signet rings, and the nose rings, and the festival rings, the mantles, the cloaks, and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans, and the veils. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of well-set hair, baldness. And branding instead of beauty. I think I skipped a line in there. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. There's a lot to unpack here. And this was a real challenge for the King James translators back in 1611 when they really just didn't know what most of these words meant. They're obviously parts of women's apparel. There's not a lot of places in the Hebrew Bible where it talks about women's apparel in such detail. And I have this great image of the King James translators over there in Cambridge going home and talking to their wives and going through their wives' things and going, hey, honey, what's this called? Sweetheart, that's a crisping pin. And what's this over here? That's my wimple. And so, yes, if you read the King James Version, it's great. Round tires like the moon and crisping pins and wimples. And they used all sorts of women clothing that they understood from their time because they had no idea what these words mean. Now, we don't have a lot better idea now. There is a great deal of these words that have a great deal of uncertainty around them. For example, where it says here, instead of well-set hair, the only here is this word translated as hair. Everywhere else, it refers to a beaten work of metal. How do you go from a beaten work of metal to hair? Tradition. Yeah, we don't know why this word would mean hair here. This is the only place where it does so. It seems to be saying instead of a beaten work of metal, there will be baldness. That doesn't make a lot of sense. The word for robe in rich robe and the word for skirt in a skirt of sackcloth occur only here. Branding instead of beauty. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually has the word shame instead of the word branding. The word branding, we're not terribly certain what it means for sure. It again is a rare word, but it might refer to slave branding, which would be a typical thing when someone is captured. And so the idea here is these vain women with all these fine clothings, they're losing all their fine clothing. They're being left with their hair chopped off. Instead of having a belt, they have nothing but a rope around them, possibly indicating captivity. That they're going to have rottenness instead of perfumes, and that they're going to be dressed in rags and they will be branded as slaves. It is supposed to be heartrending. This is a little bit of a chart I created here to give an idea of how little we know about what these things are. You have one column there, which is the King James Version from 1611, what they came up with, and then the best guess in the middle, and then the number of occurrences in the entire Hebrew Bible. And you can see that so many of these words are rather rare. This long catalog of items, apparel and jewelry, indicates quite a few items occurring nowhere else that are of uncertain meaning, as well as some others that occur elsewhere, which can be confidently identified. For example, armlets, veils, and shawls. But often when things are used elsewhere, they're used in very different contexts and don't have anything to do with women's clothing. And so their meanings aren't really clear. Like, I mean, the round tires like the moon. Everywhere else it's talking about things you put on camels. Might be some type of a crescent-shaped jewelry. At any rate, most of these things we're not really sure of. And then there's some really unusual ones. The King James had them as the tablets. More likely it is perfume boxes or possibly potion boxes. The Hebrew is actually common words, but the words are the houses of the soul. What does that mean? We don't know. We think that soul might refer to vapor, and the houses might refer to bottles. And so maybe these are perfumes, or maybe they are some type of magical potions, an aphrodisiac, something like that. Hard to say. There's a lot of this that we just do not know and is extremely uncommon. Robert Alter had some great comments on this. He said, to understand the prophet's rage at these aristocratic women flirtatiously parading about in their expensive finery, one might imagine a contemporary social critic dismayed and indignant over the plight of the homeless in New York, who sees the rich matrons of Manhattan walking along Madison Avenue in their designer dresses and coats with shopping bags filled with more of the same. So yeah, the idea here of all these things that the women have is meant to give you the sense of their superiority, their haughtiness, their pride, but then at the same time, they are still daughters. And the idea of them being brought low, having their hair cut off, being reduced to the level of slavery, being branded, is meant to tug at your heart. Now that we've dealt with the daughters, your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men, this is again a elite warrior title, your mighty men in battle. So the men are going to be killed. We've kind of stepped out of the metaphor here to speak of the reality, because now, rather than speaking of Jerusalem as a daughter, she is a city again here. And her gates shall lament and mourn. Empty, she shall sit on the ground. So we left here at this verse the metaphor to talk about the reality of what we're talking about here, that people are going to die. They're going to die in battle, and the city itself will be left in a mournful state, empty, sitting on the ground. And that's the way chapter 3 ends. Now, before we close here, we should look at this verse, which is the next verse of chapter 4. And it might belong to chapter 3. It seems to be on the same theme and doesn't match anything else in chapter 4. So maybe this belongs with the previous. It says, and 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name and take away our reproach. This does sound like it fits with the idea of the daughters of Zion that are left in a distressed state, looking for someone with leadership. And so, yes, this verse seems to belong more to chapter 3 than it does to chapter 4. It is also possible that it was just an independent verse that was placed next because thematically it matches. I like the ending on chapter 3 where she is sitting empty on the ground, and I think that's a very nice way to leave it, but it does seem like this verse might belong in completing the thought there. Anyway, what do you think? Let us know in the comments. And that's chapter 3. If you like this, please like and subscribe, and hopefully you will look forward to the next lesson as we go into chapter 4 and a bit more of a cheerful message. And we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.